Today we're going to go over solving multi-step equations. In the previous video on two-step equations, we went through the exact steps on what you need to do to solve the equation. We're not going to go through those again. I'm just going to say them orally now, so if you need to review, please look back at that video or in your notes to see how to do it. So our first equation, we're going to go through, we're supposed to read it. It says q minus 8 all divided by 2 equals 1. Here, the reason why I said all divided by 2 is because both the q and the 8 are being divided by 2. So I have to remember that and keep that in consideration. So now, since that is happening, we have something special here that we need to do. Here, in the q, we have to circle our variable and coefficient has an invisible 1 in front of it. Whenever a variable does not have a number in front of it, there's always an invisible 1. So now, because it's being divided all by 2, I need to keep this whole numerator together. That's what's different about this type of problem. I need to keep this all together because they're all being divided, or both of them are being divided by 2, and I also need to draw my river. So now our next step was to get rid of the last thing we said, the last operation and number that we said, by using the inverse property. So let's read it one more time. Q, or 1 times q, minus 8, all divided by 2. The last operation and number I said is all divided by 2. So what's the opposite of all divided by 2? It must be all multiplied by 2. So I'm going to multiply both sides by 2. Since 2 is in the denominator here, it goes in the numerator, opposite. So multiply by 2 on this side. When I do that, these cancel, because 2 divided by 2 makes 1. So now I'm left with what I circled in the beginning. So 1q minus 8 equals 2. Now, same thing I'm going to redo. Since this is multi-step, I have to go through these steps a couple times. I circle my variable and coefficient. My river was already drawn. And now you already know how to solve this from before. So what's the opposite of minus 8? It is plus 8 to both sides. So now I'm left with 1q equals 8 plus 2 is 10. Now, do I really need that 1 in front? Did I need it before? No. 1 can stay invisible, so it's just q equals 10 is my answer. And don't forget to do your check. We substitute or plug in 10 for q. So it's 10 minus 8 divided by 2 equals 1. Now remember here, you do the numerator first. So 10 minus 8 is 2. So 2 divided by 2 is 1. And so 1 equals 1. Check. That is correct. Just a little bit more here about circling the whole numerator. We kind of do this too also, so that we know this whole thing needs to be brought down to the next level, so we don't forget the minus 8. Some students might get confused and they don't bring the whole thing down, but that's why we circle the whole entire thing, so we know this whole numerator must come down first. Next problem. Same thing, I want you to try it by yourself first, and then we're going to go over it. First thing we do is we start with reading our problem. This is symmetric property again. It's just flipped in reverse. We solve it the same exact way. It doesn't matter what's on either side. Here it says 2 equals j minus 2. Remember, all divided by 3, because they're both being divided by 3. I circle my variable and coefficient. Again, there's an invisible 1 here, but since we already talked about that, I'm not going to put it there. And since this is a special case, I need to just circle the whole thing in the numerator, so I know that I must bring that entire part down. Remember, it just changed a little bit. It's not just only this variable and coefficient anymore, it's the whole numerator. So now I draw my river to separate both sides to make sure I keep equality. What I do to one side, I do to the other side. Now I need to go through and do my next step. So j minus 2 all divided by 3. The last operation and the number I said was all divided by 3. So the opposite of all divided by 3 is multiply by 3. So these cancel. Multiply this side by 3 to keep it consistent or balanced. So 3 times 2 is 6 equals, now remember, I circled the entire numerator, so j minus 2 must be brought down. Then I go through, circle my variable and coefficient, and what's opposite of minus 2? Add 2 to both sides. So 6 plus 2 is 8. 8 equals j. So j equals 8, and that is my answer. You can go ahead and do the check by yourself. Next problem. Here it's a little bit different. We have something called distributive property. I know you guys are familiar with distributive property, so we're going to go through how to do it. Very first thing that we always do is we do the distributive property always first. You need to remember that. Distributive property, make a note of this in your notebook or whatever you're working on. Distributive property is always done first. So here, distributive property means I'm going to take the -3 and I'm going to distribute or give it to both the v and the 1 that's inside our parentheses, and I have to be equal. So -3 times the quantity, v plus 1 in quantity equals 9. So now -3 times v is -3v. So -3v. Now -3 times 1 is -3 equals 9. So now I have an equation that we already know how to solve. We're very familiar with this, so I circle my variable and coefficient, draw my river. How do I get rid of -3? I add 3 to both sides, they cancel. So -3v, or -3 times v equals 12. Now here we have a negative, it must stay with the 3. So how do I get rid of -3 times v? Divide both sides by -3, cancels, so v equals -4. And the check, again, we substitute the number n for v. So I have -3 times the quantity, -4 plus 1 equals 9. We go through GMDOS on this side. So GMDOS says grouping comes first. So -4 plus 1 is -3. So -3 times -3 equals 9. -3 times -3 is 9. Okay, the next problem again, it has distributive properties. So we're going to have to distribute the 3 to what's inside my parentheses, the h and the positive 1. So 3 times h is 3h plus, bring down the positive sign, 3 times 1 is 3, and bring down your 9. We circle our variable and coefficient. In this case, it's 3 and h, so circle our variable and coefficient. We draw our river so we can keep the sides balanced. I get rid of whatever's not circled, so plus 3. The opposite of plus 3 is subtract 3 on both sides. So 9 minus 3 is 6. So 6 equals, bring down what's in the circle, 3h. Now, this is 3 times h. The opposite of multiply is divide. So I divide by 3 on both sides. So these cancel. So h equals 6 divided by 3 is 2. And you can go ahead and check your answer. Next problem. If you see this one, again, it's distributive property, but look, now we have a negative we have to be aware of on the outside, and also there's a difference here. We have a negative variable too. So we have to take all of that into consideration when we are solving our equation. So we start with distributive property, always distributive property first. I do the first one, I give the 5 to 2, so -5 times 2 is -10. Now, remember before I said what comes, the symbol that comes before the variable or before the number belongs to that number or variable. Here there's a negative in front of it, so this negative is going to belong to t. So when I multiply, I'm actually multiplying -5 times -t. So -5 times -t, a negative times a negative is going to give me a positive, so that becomes 5t equals 20. Now I have an equation that we're familiar with. I circle my variable and coefficient. Remember, the positive belongs with the 5. And I draw my river. Now, how do I get rid of minus 10 or negative 10? It is plus 10 to both sides. So 5t equals 30. Now I still need to get rid of the 5. So 5 times t, opposite is divide by 5 on both sides. So t equals 6. There you have it. Okay, the last one here is again a fraction, and we learned a way to get rid of fractions. Here it says 2/3 times the quantity 6 times x plus 6 equals 12. When I want to get rid of the fraction in this case, we learned something called reciprocal. So here we can get rid of this fraction before we do anything on the inside. Before we touch anything here, we can get rid of the fraction by using the reciprocal. So the reciprocal of 2/3 is 3/2. When I do this, when I multiply this side by 3/2, the 3's cancel with each other, the 2's cancel with each other. We can also see this by multiplying straight across. 3 times 2 is 6, 2 times 3 is 6, so 6 over 6 is 1. So now, if whatever I do to this side, I draw my river to remind myself I have to do this side. So if I multiply this side by the reciprocal, which is 3/2, I also have to multiply this side by the reciprocal of 3/2. But I have a whole number multiplied by a rational number or a fraction. So how do I make my whole number into a fraction? I put it over 1. So now I can multiply fractions. Remember, when I multiply fractions, I multiply straight across. So 12 times 3 is 36 over 2. So now this canceled out, so what I'm left with is what's inside the parentheses. So 6x plus 6 equals 36 over 2. Now I start with doing my variable and coefficient, circling it, and I already have my river, so I don't have to worry about that. But look, I have a fraction here too. I can simplify this. What is 36 divided by 2? It is 18. So I can change that to 18. So 6x plus 6 equals 18. Again, circle my variable and coefficient. How do I get rid of plus 6? Minus 6 from both sides. They cancel because they make 0. So 6x equals 12. Now 6 times x equals 12. The opposite of times is division. So x equals 12 divided by 6, which is 2. Now again, there are different ways you can get rid of the fraction. This is just one simple way we could have done it. We could have actually used the distributive property and distributed, but it's easier for us to get rid of the fraction before we distribute and make it even more complicated, because sometimes it might not work evenly in your problem. If you have any questions, please ask me in class.